in a populist moment, there's a tendency to empower critics and outsiders. That can be a useful thing and it can be important to do. And the institutions of our government need to be criticized and need to be confronted with what they don't do well. But to empower critics to run the entire institution is a different kind of approach to empowering critics than I think we've seen before in American government. And I don't think it's working very well so far.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. This week's episode is all about the tension between executive power, Congress, and the courts. The Trump administration has spent its first 6 months trying to broaden the scope of what the president can do, and it's certainly shaping civil society. But we have a government of checks and balances. What is the role and responsibility of other democratic institutions, and what has been the impact on them? Let's find out. My guests are Yuval Levin, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and author of books including The Fractured Republic and A Time to Build, and Robert Shea, an Academy Fellow and CEO of GovNavigators and former Associate Director at the Office of Management and Budget. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Let's start with a question to both of you. From your perspectives, how well has our system of checks and balances held up in recent years, particularly during the first months of the second Trump administration? Are we in a unique moment when it comes to relationships between the different branches of government? Yuval, why don't we start with you, and then Robert, your thoughts as well.
I think we are in a fairly distinct moment in the sense that the challenge we face is a function of a willful weakness of the legislative branch that I think was not really anticipated by the framers of the American system. We tend to think about presidential power and judicial power because we're struck by these titanic struggles between the president and the courts. But I think that in a way it is the dog that isn't barking that's the one to really notice here, and it's the weakness of Congress. Our system is out of balance because the legislative branch is intentionally staying out of the game and weakening itself by choice in a way that I do think badly undermines the separation of powers and the balance of power in our system. I think it puts the other branches in impossible situations. The framers of the Constitution would not have been surprised by a president who wants more and more power. They would have been worried about it, but not surprised. They would not have been surprised by judicial overreach of various sorts. I do think they would have been surprised by an underreaching Congress. And that's the problem that worries me most in this moment.
Robert, you've worked in Congress and in the executive branch. What are your thoughts?
It's definitely a unique moment. I think there have been examples where the separation of powers have failed us that we've already seen. We're yet to see the extent of the breakage, I think. And the courts, we have to wait and see where they land. Many of the decisions that have been made so far are really not made on the core decisions that are before them. They're more procedural. And so the substantive decisions about the ability to fire civil servants, the spending authority of the president, those core decisions have yet to really be made. So following closely the extent to which those separation of powers are sustained or they further dissolve. I agree with Yuval that Congress's role here is not a traditional one. When I worked at OMB, the appropriators in particular, we said there were Republicans, Democrats, and appropriators. But even they, in recent months, have stood down as the administration tests its ability to impound funds. I worked on the oversight committees in my early days. I won't tell you how long ago that was. But the chairman at the time, Bill Klinger, he thought that the chairmanship of those committees ought to be vested in the opposite of the presidential party, so that there was at least some institutional body in the Congress who was taking its oversight responsibility more seriously. So that's an interesting tweak that we might consider in the future.
Robert, I'm going to want to follow up on something you said about the courts, but I want to stay on Congress for a moment here. Yuval, you mentioned, I think, about the weakness of Congress. If Congress has been too reluctant to assert its constitutional role in checking the executive branch, what does it take to restore that balance? Is it strictly a partisan issue or is it something else?
It's not entirely a partisan issue. It's been evident in both parties, although I do think that the tendency has been stronger among Republicans during the Trump era than we've really seen before. The sense that their job is basically to advance the president's agenda. This is not a natural way for members of Congress to think about their relationship, even with a president of their own party. They understand themselves as advancing the party's message more than they understand themselves being engaged in a process of legislative bargaining. They're not wrong to think that it might be a better use of their time for their advancement of their own career to build a social media following than to pay a lot of attention to their committee work. And I think that points us in the direction of what would need to change. In order to change the incentives members face, their legislative work has to actually matter more, which means we do need some decentralization of power in both houses. We need a way to help members' committee work matter. The committees, to my mind, are at the center of what has gone wrong and what's now missing in Congress. And there has to be some rethinking of the budget process, which we've been living with for 50 years now and is not serving the 21st century Congress. The trouble is all these kinds of reforms would need to be desired by members. And that means that members in today's Congress have to see that something's wrong with how the institution is functioning.
Robert, are we seeing a unitary executive or something else?
I think so. And if the restraints on the president regarding the budget dissolve, if the ability to fire career civil servants at will is sustained, if Congress's statutory insistent that some agencies be declared independent is ruled invalid. It's maybe for a lack of imagination, but it's hard for me to envision rebuilding those constraints. Maybe we need something like a Reconstruction era where we can rebuild some of these institutions to comport with the decisions that are made about them. But Yuval's right. I think incentives are not there, and it's just tough for me to think that they would want to restore those. So the unitary executive that so many conservatives have been advancing does seem to be manifesting.
I think it's worth drawing a distinction that I think will be very important to the Supreme Court in the next few years when we think about the unitary executive. And that is a distinction between the president's power over the executive branch on the one hand and the president's power in the system of the separation of powers on the other. The traditional conservative idea of the unitary executive, which I think this court will be advocating, says that the president controls the executive branch. And so if the question is, can the president hire and fire? If the question is, are the agencies answerable to the president? I do think we're going to see movement in the direction of answering yes. But to the question of, does the president dominate our system? I actually think this Supreme Court is very much inclined to say no. And if the question is, can the president decline to spend appropriated money? I think it's extremely unlikely that this Supreme Court will allow for impoundment on any scale. If the question is ultimately, is the president accountable to Congress, this Supreme Court is very much inclined to say yes. And so I think we should separate the question of the president's power in relation to Congress from the question of the president's power in relation to the executive branch. And it certainly seems to me that the current Supreme Court will separate those questions and think about them very differently.
I think that's a good distinction. As you noted, we've seen moments in which the courts have pushed back on perceived executive overreach, and then certainly times when it seems to have enabled it. How would you assess the judiciary's performance in maintaining the constitutional boundaries, not just for this current administration, but administrations past as well, Yuval?
I think the court has done very well given the extraordinary pressures that it's under in this situation so far. But as Robert mentioned at the beginning, the court so far has really avoided the core questions of the separation of powers and tried to allow those questions to reach it slowly and gradually, so that in the emergency docket so far, they've dealt with procedural issues, with issues of standing. They've not actually dealt with the fundamental questions. Can the president outlaw birthright citizenship? Can the president impound money? These big questions of the separation of powers, I don't think we've encountered yet. For what it's worth, I think the court will say no on both of those fronts by a large majority, but I don't know. And I think those kinds of questions remain outstanding in a way that suggests that the next term of the Supreme Court is going to be enormously important for structural constitution questions, questions of some basic parameters of the powers of the presidency and the Congress are going to be resolved in the coming year in ways that will make it easier to know how to answer your question. I would say so far, I think the court has held up pretty well, but it has done a lot of that by avoiding the biggest question.
This is all very nuanced, and you've both touched on this. We have not necessarily a ruling or a decision, but certainly a recent action or even inaction, if you will, by the Supreme Court as it relates to the president's ability to resize the federal workforce. Robert, help us understand kind of what happened. Why is it important as it relates specifically to the federal workforce, not necessarily the broader issues that you've all just mentioned?
For about 100 years, the federal government has operated with a pretty bright distinction between career civil servants and political appointees. And career civil servants enjoyed protection from punishment for political bias. They were deemed to be the professional workforce that sustained the government from administration to administration. Now, over time, the ability to hold that workforce accountable calcified. It has always been, at least until now, really hard to fire poor performers, to hold poor performers accountable for their performance. It was really difficult to keep up with hiring because it took so long. The administration is testing those protections and has removed a significant portion of the workforce for little or no reason. So the professionalism of that workforce is under threat. It'll be interesting to see the extent to which these activities enhance the skills and performance of the remaining workforce, or whether those remain diminished. If you think about it logically, you got to assume that if you offer a buyout to whole swaths of the workforce, those who are likely to get better or at least the same jobs in the private sector are the ones most likely to take it. So that'll leave you with presumably a lower performing workforce. So this has all got to shake out, but those protections are being tested. And I suspect the courts are going to rule in favor of the administration in this arena. So those protections will be washed away until we can think of another way to restore them.
Robert, you've worked in the executive branch and the legislative branch specifically on large-scale personnel reform and measuring government performance. You mentioned protections, you mentioned a professional workforce. The current administration really is making aims for accountability, policy responsiveness, and making sure that the workforce can really serve the American people. We can agree that perhaps there was some missteps in the process and in the way of rolling out some of these policies, but are there things that have been done well, and are there things that you think will actually lead to meaningful reform?
That's a loaded question. I often tell people, if back then I knew we had these kind of flexibilities, that would have been dangerous. Theoretically, linking someone's appraisal to the extent to which they contributed to the program's overall performance is like the holy grail of individual performance management. So I applaud that. But it's really hard in implementation because of some of the very difficult things that government programs are designed to achieve. But you want to get away from really measuring just activities. You don't want number of regulations or amount of contracting or grants you've issued. You really do want to assess the extent to which individuals are doing stuff that has an impact on the populations they're trying to serve. So in that arena, hopefully we will have made progress. I also think holding individuals accountable for performance, the administration has said it shouldn't take so long to get rid of people who aren't doing their job, and that you shouldn't reward an individual in their performance appraisal simply for doing their job. So those kinds of things implemented professionally, I do think can have lasting positive impacts.
I think that's a good point, Robert. And a lot of the action we're seeing from the current administration can be seen as the administration trying to do its best for the population that it serves. You've argued that populism left unchecked can erode institutions. Are we seeing a populist movement? And how has that reshaped the relationship between government and the people? And what does that mean for the future?
Yeah, I think we do see the basic character of populism in the administration's approach to public administration so far. And it relates to the points Robert was just making, which I very much agree with. I think, in a sense, the administration is relatively clear about what it wants to get rid of and not very clear about what it wants to build and construct and do differently. And you see this in its relationship to the federal workforce, too, where their sense is that the problem they face is a lot of people are doing things they shouldn't be doing, and getting rid of those people is the challenge for public administration. That is one challenge, and it's an important one. But if you ask yourself, how's the administration building a structure for managing these institutions? How are they approaching the core challenge of public administration? I don't think they're really approaching that as the problem they're trying to solve. And I think more generally, in a populist moment, there's a tendency to empower critics and outsiders. That can be a useful thing, and it can be important to do. And the institutions of our government need to be criticized and need to be confronted with what they don't do well. But to empower critics to run the entire institution, to take someone who has a criticism of the way in which the Pentagon is operated on one dimension or HHS on another dimension and say, okay, you run it, is a different kind of approach to empowering critics than I think we've seen before in American government. And I don't think it's working very well so far. Running the institution is not the same as offering essential criticism. And ultimately, the administration tends not to think of itself as acting on the inside, as actually running the institutions. It still operates as a critic. It still operates by way of trying to find problems that outsiders would point to. And I think the core challenge of thinking about government in the first person has not been overcome so far in this second Trump term in the way that I think it never was overcome in the first. The president has to see himself as actually being the chief insider in our system. And as long as he operates as an outsider and everybody else takes that cue from him, I think we'll continue to see enormous problems. And they are endemic to populism around the world in ways.
Robert, let's be a bit critical here. When thinking about how government performs, what would you say are the most urgent reforms or cultural shifts needed to ensure our best system of government? And that if we're trying to achieve the most effective, efficient, and accountable outcomes, what might need to happen to do that?
I can't help but reflect on your position, James-Christian. You lead a historic institution that was chartered by Congress to study and share what are the best management practices that the government ought to adopt. And like other institutions, yours is under threat. You've got the challenge to sustain it and grow it in this environment. And so no pressure, but I think it's all on you to make sure this pipeline of good ideas remains so that government can learn from the experience of what's worked across governments at every level. But the struggle to measure government performance is a decades-long problem. The most recent innovation in that arena, the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which required agencies and programs to do a better job studying the extent to which their programs are having the intended impact. And I think that the momentum of building that evidence has stalled, but I think it's a critical piece in deciding what ought to be sustained. In this administration, it would seem to me a really helpful tool. If you want smaller, smarter government, find those programs shown to be effective through rigorous evidence and put your money there instead of programs that are either proven to be ineffective or that we don't know whether or not they're effective. There are lots of other things. If you're a hammer, as I've been in the evidence-based management arena, everything looks like a nail. So it really does seem to me a critical thing that ought to be restored and sustained.
Robert, thank you. I appreciate your comments. And I'll very quickly say I don't do it alone because you're one of them. We have over 1,000 elected fellows of the National Academy of Public Administration who are all earnestly seeking to help our government be at its best. I'd also say there is this concept that a lot of organizations are under threat, and I think that's true for a number of them. For the academy, the way I see it is we have a lot of opportunity. We have such a diverse group of fellows in thought and in experience that this time right now, I think we can draw upon that expertise and that knowledge to really see the opportunity of how to help government reform and how to make sure that in the end, it is always about being effective and efficient, accountable, and transparent. As you're also aware, we've put out a number of analyses looking at the very core issues that we think the administration, or really any administration, should be paying attention to. And I think that this is just an important moment for any administration, but certainly the current one, to recognize that there are groups and there are individuals that have been there, done that, sat at the table, have been responsible for implementation of different policies. And if you have an organization like ours, congressionally chartered and nonpartisan, working at all levels of government with such value to draw from, if you were to tap into that as a resource, you probably have the greatest chance to achieving your agenda and ultimately doing the best for the American people.
Look at that. I teed up an ad for the National Academy Administration so seamlessly into this conversation.
That's right. It all has the benefit of being true. Yuval, let me ask you my final question for you. I really want to stay on this idea around the tension between the executive branch, Congress, and the courts, and how we have a balanced government that really helps keep everything in check. What's the one thing that you would say is important for us to get right in this moment about achieving that balance and reminding the people that you do have democratic institutions that are trying to serve them and making sure that no one part of our system becomes more powerful than another?
First of all, let me say I think it's really wonderful to hear that you think of this moment as an opportunity, because I think that is the way to think about this moment. Things are changing. A lot of things we've taken for granted for a long time are no longer taken for granted. In some ways, that's easy to see as a threat, and in some ways it is a threat, but it has to be seen as an opportunity. I'm a hammer too, and for me, the nail is always Congress, and so I'm going to get to Congress here. I think that what's really essential in this moment is the first branch of our government understand the essential role it plays and defend its prerogatives. I think members have to be genuinely offended by the idea that the basic powers they have would be taken from them. They have to develop a capacity to be offended by intrusions into their prerogatives. It would have been unbelievable to observers of Congress until the last decade or so that could happen, but it has happened. And to me, the thing to keep our eye on is, are members taking offense when their prerogatives are threatened? I think we see some of that around the impoundment debates. That's healthy. I think we should see a lot more of it, and Congress has to reassert its fundamentally primary and central place in the system if any of this is going to work.
My answer would be that we're so unmoored from a common understanding of the truth that it's really difficult to navigate the policy landscape. The best way to restore that is a common agreement that we should sustain and strengthen the statistical ecosystem that's made up by the statistical agencies of the executive branch of the federal government. They ought to be removed from political interference and invested in to the extent to which they can keep providing the American people and the government, all branches, a single source of the truth. There are other sources of information, of course, but at its core, these agencies really tell us what's going on in the nation. They are a window on its health and performance that really should be protected.
You just heard from Robert that sources of truth are really important. You heard earlier from Yuval that responsibility of the different branches are key. And I shared that there's opportunity ahead if we're thinking about how best to serve the American people. We'll close it there. Thanks to both of you for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.